Okay, so welcome formally to Know Your Knotweed, Identification, Impacts, and Management. Oops, sorry, just having. So we'll go through an intro portion of the workshop and then jump into identification of, broadly, how do we see knotweed out in the environment while we're working in our yard, out on a hike, kayaking, going to work, and then teasing out the differences between the specific species that you can find in the Adirondack region. We'll go into ecosystem impacts and, really what's the cascade of issues resulting from this very, very dominant competitive plant growing in local habitats in the Adirondacks. There's nothing inherently wrong with a plant, but if it has a lot of negative impacts ecologically, economically, and socially, there's something we need to address. We'll jump into management after that. Zach will lead us in management and going anywhere from prevention methods through manual control to chemical controls. And then finally, what resources can APIP, the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, offer you all as local practitioners in restoration, landscape specialists, homeowners, volunteers, and just interested community members. And then we'll get into our Q&A. So let's jump into introductions. I am Emily Bell Dinan. I am the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program's Education Outreach Coordinator. You might be familiar with APIP. You might not be familiar with APIP, but we have never had a full-time education and outreach coordinator before. And so I'm happy to meet you all and start working with you out. It's a long-term relationship. We're excited to have this new position. I am joined today by, we haven't discussed it, so Becca and Zach, I'm going to introduce you if that's okay, or you can introduce yourselves. Just let me know. We have on the line Becca Bernacki. She is the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program's new terrestrial invasive species project coordinator, coming from to us from Ausable Forks. An excellent person working in GIS and terrestrial invasive species management. Then we have, if you have worked with APIP in the past, you might be familiar with our other speaker, Zachary Simek, who has now moved on to a new title, Conservation and GIS Analyst. And we actually APIP now shares Zach with the St. Lawrence Lake Ontario PRISM, SLELO for short. But we can never share him. Zach is ours in the Adirondacks. So we'll hear from Zach to talk about management. I have some polls. I'm not sure if you have or have not participated in Zoom polls before, but with this being, there's quite a digital divide, and I'd like to learn about who's in the room and learn about you. So if you don't mind answering a few questions, it'll help us guide where we go in the workshop today and just get to know each other a little bit. Oh, and I misspelled owl, if you see here. It's a very complicated word. So I'm going to launch the polling. Feel free to answer. All right. Got a few more people if you haven't answered, but it's okay if you don't want to identify yourself. Or I apologize if you don't see yourself represented here. All right, I'm going to end polling. Can everyone see that? So transportation folks, thank you for joining us again. I think I've hooked you from our previous workshop and outreach. We've got some conservation professionals in the room. We have at least 3 plant nerds, which is really good to know. That means that we might be going a little high. We don't want to go too high level or too low level for anybody in the room. And we actually have some conservation professionals on the line as well. Everybody's interested in knotweed. How can we control it? All right, we've got a few more polls. If I can work Zoom correctly. Here we go. Oh, I'm sorry. Cool, this helps me a lot. Okay. This is excellent. It's kind of a 50-50 room, and this helps me understand. I think the yes people are a lot of our transportation folks, which is excellent. This is great. And one last poll. Have you interacted with knotweeds before? Oh my gosh. All right, I'm going to end this one. Okay, this is great. Everyone, almost everyone, 77% of folks have interacted with knotweed in some way, shape, or form. I know I certainly have. I know my co-hosts certainly have, but it's really good to know if you're new to this. And then I should do like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you hate this plant? But I don't have that. I don't have that poll. So thank you all for doing that with me. So just an introduction to what is APIP. The Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program has been around since 1998. We were co-founded by these 4 different agency and nonprofit partners: the Nature Conservancy, the Department who we are housed and managed by today, the Department of Environmental Conservation, who funds our program, the Adirondack Park Agency, who is a close partner, and the New York State Department of Transportation, which sometimes seems like an outlier, but the way that we've found the majority of terrestrial invasive species spread across Adirondack Park is through transportation and utility corridors. So it's very important to work with people in maintenance, in design, in treatment and application, to talk to them about preventing the spread of invasive terrestrial plants. Our goals are to prevent new infestations, to rapidly detect and eradicate new infestations, and then really where it applies to knotweed is manage existing priority infestations to mitigate their impact. So knotweed is a plant that has, really ravaged a lot of parts of New York State, and we're relatively, we have relatively lower abundance up here in the Adirondacks, but it is a plant where we're going to have to focus on management and preventing the spread, and know that it is something that cannot be eradicated on a broad landscape scale. So that's what we're going to really talk about today is, as a property owner, how can we focus on minimizing the population as much as possible and practice and employing best management practices while we do so. So the word invasive, I don't want to spend too much time on this, especially if so many folks have worked with knotweed. You know that what a lot of definitions of invasive plants are. But going into APIP's management strategies and goals, context matters. Is it a non-native plant and it has been introduced to a new geography, like how these California poppies, certainly aren't native to our part of North America, but they are a North American plant. So it becomes a kind of gray area. Is it a nuisance species like a dandelion that we have had in North America for hundreds and hundreds of years? But it really doesn't have a negative ecological, economic, or social impact. So we might weed it out of our garden, but it's not something that we need to really focus a huge amount of resources, time, and energy on. And then we get to this third category, an invasive species, or in other states, a noxious weed. What is the context matters, right? So here I have pictured a big leaf lupin, which is actually native to other parts of North America, but not native to the Adirondacks. So that's not inherently bad, but what is the environmental issue that this plant is causing? It is changing soil chemistry. It grows very rapidly, and so it outcompetes adjacent vegetation. It can grow very rapidly in riparian corridors or stream and river habitats and wetlands, and so it will displace plants that really hold sediments together in waterways or feed other pollinators. It's very, very beautiful, and I will note this type of lupin is my absolute favorite lupin, and we have thousands of lupins across North America. But if it's causing ecological, economic, and social harm, there is a problem. So why are some non-native species invasive? They might lack predators in a new geography. They might lack the parasites that limit that population in a new geography, or they might not be, contained by climate controls that they've evolved into in a new geography. So I kind of equated this in my last workshop to Superman coming to Earth. On his planet, he's just a regular guy. He's got controls, and then comes to Earth to a whole new geography, and suddenly his climate's new, his gravity is new, his sun is new, and he is out of control, the strongest person on Earth. So that's kind of how a lot of invasive species operate that we target. And knotweed is an excellent example of that. It's kind of the evil Superman, bizarro world Superman. They might produce many, many seeds or successfully reproduce in many different avenues. So knotweed is a great example, and we'll talk about this more of how it can grow from its stems, from its roots or rhizomes. It's a generalist. Invasive species that we define as a target plant are generalists, so they can handle many different types of light, many types of precipitation, many different types of soil, whereas native plants that might have evolved in a certain habitat can only handle one narrow definition for light, soil, or rain. And then they monopolize resources. So here's a good example of water chestnut completely dominating a system, or Phragmites completely dominating a system. It will really monopolize resources for light, for soil nutrients, for space, for height in the canopy. I'm not going to go too far down this path of all the benefits of having native biodiverse habitats, because I know Becca will jump into this a bit later. But plants are the foundation of the food web. They create shelter and habitat. They can cycle greenhouse gases out of the air and into the soil. They can store carbon. They stabilize soils. Very important. They're an economic engine for tourism, for sports, for food, right? We used to have salmon, no more salmon. For medicine, a lot of our medicine comes from diverse, healthy forests. And for agriculture, if we don't have diverse habitat to support pollinators, we don't have pollinators to support our food web, our human food web either. And then biodiversity is correlative with climate resiliency. So if we have a bigger suite of species to handle a change in climate, we have more tools in the toolbox to see what is going to survive in a new habitat or a new climate, temperature, precipitation regime versus, we only have 3 plants and we have to hope that those 3 plants will make it through. If you have knotweed on your property, I don't have to go into the economic impacts of fast-growing competitive invasive species, but from reduced productivity of a habitat in terms, say it's less fish or soil loss or soil chemistry changes or impacts of tourism, reduced property values, impaired recreation, right? If we have a waterway completely full of milfoil, sorry, got distracted. We can't, water ski in that milfoil. We can't fish in that milfoil. We can't paddle in that milfoil. It's no fun. And then a really important issue having to do with knotweed is also drainage and flood control issues. Knotweed love moist, wet areas, and they grow very rapidly, and they can fill your culvert, they can fill your drainage ditch, they can go into your pipes. The drainage and flood control problems are not insignificant. So now I am going to turn it over to my wonderful co-host, Becca. I'm going to share my screen with her.
Hi folks, just give us a second as I take control of Emily's screen here. So we're going to talk today about the identification, impacts, and spread of knotweed. And we're first going to get started with some general identification. I know a lot of you folks are pretty familiar with this species, but we do have some folks who have never seen it before. So in the Adirondacks, we have 3 knotweed species present, and these are Japanese, giant, and Bohemian knotweed. These are all shrubs, and they grow to varying heights, but they're all pretty tall with giant knotweed sometimes exceeding 19 feet in height. All these species are pretty similar, so we're going to talk about their similarities first in general identification, and then we're going to get into their differences and how to identify between the different species. So the first thing I look for when I'm identifying knotweed, aside from dense stands of knotweed alongside the edge of the road, is I look at the leaves. And the leaves are generally thought of as heart-shaped. So if you look at the leaf here, you can see it's kind of got a flat or a little indent here at the base and a little bit of a pointed tip. These leaves are also alternate on the stem. So as opposed to being directly across from each other, they're spaced, one on one side, one on the other. And that pattern continues. These leaves are typically at least 6 inches long, although that does vary by species. And another important thing I look for when I'm identifying knotweed is the distinct zigzag pattern of the branch. You can see on the branch here, it kind of zigs and zags as the leaves attach. So oftentimes when we get inquiry calls from the public, folks are asking, what's this bamboo growing on my property? Knotweed is very bamboo-like in respect to its stem, and it has ridges or nodes every 4 to 6 inches, as you can see here, and it's hollow, so very, very bamboo-like. It's light green in color and often has reddish or purple blotches on the stem. So knotweed also flowers, and these blooms are present from August to September in our region. And it has these large, wispy, white clusters of small flowers that are present at the end of its branches. So we're going to talk a lot later in the presentation about how knotweed spreads, and its roots or lateral rhizomes are very, very important to that spread. These roots are brown in color with an orange interior, as you can see in this picture, and they account for up to 2/3 of the plant's biomass. There's a lot going on below the ground that we don't see in addition to the above ground biomass of that plant. And they may extend up to 40 feet from the stem, so you can just imagine how fast this plant can spread with those extensive rhizomes. What's important to note is that segments as small as 1 centimeter may form new infestations. So if folks go out and try digging up knotweed, it's very, very important to get all the root segments, as any small segment that's left behind can form a new plant. So let's talk about some of the differences between species. As I noted, there are 3 species present in the Adirondack region. We have giant knotweed, Bohemian knotweed, and Japanese knotweed. And I put Bohemian knotweed in between the other 2 species because it's a hybrid cross of the giant and Japanese knotweed. The first way you can tell the difference between these 3 species is that giant knotweed grows to be the largest of the 3, sometimes exceeding 19 feet in height, where Japanese knotweed grows to about 12, so still very, very large. with Bohemian knotweed being intermittent between the two at about 16 feet. In addition to the size that it grows to, the leaf size also differs between the three species. Giant knotweed leaves are very large and can exceed 12 inches in length, or Japanese knotweed is typically more in the range of 6 inches in length, with Bohemian being intermittent between the two. Another important identifier here is the leaf base, so the bottom, where the stem attaches to the branch. In giant knotweed, it's deeply heart-shaped. It has this nice V in it, where Japanese knotweed is more flat or blunt, and the hybrid knotweed is a little intermittent between the two. The leaf tip is also distinctive between the three. Japanese knotweed is finely pointed, so it's got this really sharp tip, where giant knotweed is more blunt or acute. It's more rounded, with hybrid in between the two. And while we're talking about these differences, I think it's really important to know that, every plant's different. So, you might see Japanese knotweed that has a more heart-shaped leaf base. We need to take all the identifying factors into consideration when we're identifying these species. So we all know that knotweed can invade a variety of habitats. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I love this picture that Emily chose here because it really shows how aggressive knotweed is. We have some knotweed here just growing right up through some asphalt, which is, really demonstrates the aggressive nature of this plant. So like most invasive species, knotweed proliferates in disturbed habitats. And one of the most common places we see knotweed is on roadsides. These roadsides, are targets of disturbance events. We mow them, we ditch them. There's a lot of disturbance that happens here. So you can see here, this roadside has been completely taken over by knotweed, and it's almost blocking that stop sign there, which can lead to issues for safety if folks don't see that stop sign and stop at that intersection. Knotweed is also, I went too far there. Knotweed is also commonly found on forest edges. Again, these tend to be more disturbed habitats. And in these cases, typically if you were driving by and saw this forest edge, off in the distance on say the Northway or something, you'd expect to see herbaceous or non-woody, plants, some native shrubs, and then trees. You can see here that knotweed's kind of outcompeting a lot of those native species at different levels within, the forest structure. Knotweed's also commonly found in folks' yards. We'll talk a little bit later about how mowing can help spread knotweed. So if you had a little patch of knotweed in your yard and you ran over it with your lawnmower, before too long you might have something that looks like this. And no one wants a yard that looks like this. We like our kids and grandkids to be able to go play in the yards and play with our dogs and have those nice open spaces. Knotweed's also very common along stream and river corridors. These are also high disturbance areas. In the spring we get high water, and that scours the soils and can help spread things, and knotweed proliferates in that habitat. So let's talk about some of the impacts of knotweed. So let's first talk about the ecological impacts. So I mentioned before that, or Emily mentioned before, that biodiversity loss often happens as a result of invasive species. One of the main drivers of this is, as Emily mentioned, these species are, usually generalists, so they can grow just about anywhere. They usually grow very, very fast. So once they're introduced to an area, they can grow really fast and outcompete the native species. They can shade them out and grab all the nutrients up so that the native species can't grow there. This loss of biodiversity is also bad for our wildlife. Wildlife really loves those different habitat layers. If you look at this first picture here, we have a lot of knotweed. There are some trees, but there's not really that herbaceous layer, those non-woody plants. And habitat wildlife uses those areas for both food and shelter, and they're really losing that as a result of these monocultures of knotweed. If you look at this bottom picture here, we'll see, one of the scarier impacts of knotweed, which is stream-side erosion. If you think back to that picture I showed of knotweed's rhizomes, you can see that it's fairly thick root, and they don't have those fine roots that you typically see with herbaceous plants and larger trees even. And it's really those fine roots that help stabilize our soils and hold the soils together so that when high water events come through, those soils aren't eroded. You can see what happens with the larger knotweed roots in this bottom picture. It looks like probably a storm event came through, they had some high water, and it just washed all of that knotweed material and the soils right into the stream. As a result of this, water quality is obviously impacted. There's a lot of sedimentation from that erosion that happened. And water quality is also impacted in another way. We talked about how knotweed can outcompete our native species. If knotweed gets established in an area like this bottom picture before the native tree species can get established, the stream lacks the shading from those trees. And that shading really helps cool the waters. These warmer waters, as a result of the lack of trees, result in more algae, which lowers oxygen content and also increased evaporation. And all those things are really terrible for our fisheries. So we'll talk about some of the societal impacts. I'm going to break this down by the 4 areas where we talked about where knotweed really is successful. So the first area we talked about are roadsides. And if you look at this bottom picture, knotweed can grow quickly and block signs and lines of sight. I'm sure we've all pulled into an intersection and want to pull out and you can't see because there's something growing there, and sometimes that something is knotweed. Emily also touched on the fact that knotweed really tends to like these damp areas, so it often blocks culverts, which can lead to roadside flooding and really grow in our ditches. We also talked about forest edges. And we got into this a little bit, but we have habitat loss for our native plants as they're outcompeted by this knotweed. When we're driving by, we like looking at all the different layers, all the shrubs and herbaceous plants as well as the trees. It's less picturesque if you just have this wall of knotweed. Emily also mentioned that these areas are all less resilient. If something comes through and knocks out the knotweed, that would be great, but it's often going to open the window to other invasives through disturbance. And we want, resilient habitats that are diverse so that, they can be successful into the future.
Becca, can I use a baseball analogy there?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like having a deep bench. Like you want a really strong deep bench, and that's biodiversity. If you're only, relying on your starting lineup, it's, when you come to the 7th inning, you're going to be pretty tired and pretty weak. So that's also where we're talking about resiliency of biodiversity. I've been thinking about baseball a lot. I'm sorry. Thank you. Go ahead, Becca.
And also, we've talked about how knotweed outcompetes those herbaceous or non-woody species. These are the species that are generally pretty important for pollinators, and that has impacts for our food systems, going forward. We also talked about how knotweed grows in yards. We can see this little girl here up in this top picture. She probably just wants to kick a ball around with mom and dad, but her yard's full of knotweed. We don't want to see that. If your yard does happen to border on a riparian area, you can see soil loss as a result of that erosion that we talked about. Another societal impact occurs in our riparian areas. They impede recreational access. If you're wanting to go out and, fly fish for trout, you don't want to have to climb through knotweed with a 9-foot pole. It's going to be a challenge and not so fun. And also, if these knotweeds have, outcompeted native trees early in the successional trajectory, that fishery might be destroyed from warming of the waters, resulting in lower fish counts. You also don't want to have to drag a kayak or canoe through these dense knotweed stands to go enjoy our rivers and streams. So let's talk about the economic impacts. I know a lot of folks on the call mentioned that they're pretty familiar with knotweed, so I'm sure you're familiar with the high direct cost of control. Most infestations require at least 5 years of treatment, so there's a lot of time and money invested in controlling this plant. Another thing we like to mention is the cost of repairs. These rhizomes are very, very aggressive. We showed a picture earlier where you could see it growing straight through the asphalt. And in this picture, you can see it just breaking apart these folks' flower garden here. It's been known to grow through concrete and asphalt that's over 3 inches thick. So it's a very, very aggressive plant. So we have to think about not only the cost of control, but the cost of repairs related to knotweed. So getting into some vectors of spread here. I've been talking a lot about these root systems and rhizomes of knotweed. So you can see here how deep and far those rhizomes really do spread from the plant. The rhizomes are very extensive. They're very, very fast growing and very aggressive. As we mentioned earlier, these rhizomes can sometimes extend up to 40 feet away from the stems of the plant. And this is really important for spread of knotweed because these rhizomes can produce new plant shoots. So as those rhizomes spread, 40 feet from the plant, we can see new plants popping up along those rhizomes above the surface of the ground, increasing the size of our infestations. All right, I'm just advancing the slide here. Oh, not too far. Forgive the glitchiness of the slides here. We'll get there. So I think my slide should be coming up here. Yeah, there we go. We're going to talk about fragmentation. Fragmentation is one of the biggest ways that knotweed spreads. It's really, really important to note that knotweed, like new knotweeds, can bud from pieces of both rhizomes and spreads. So you can see in this upper right-hand picture, we just have a little piece of knotweed, and say you mowed over this knotweed and left all those fragments on the ground. Each one of those fragments can become a new knotweed plant, expanding your infestation, which is really the opposite of what you want to be doing. The same thing with those rhizomes. You can see in the bottom left-hand picture, we're talking about, not only can those new knotweed plants prop up from the rhizomes when, they're underground and attached to the main stem still. If you were to try to dig this out and broke apart a whole bunch of little pieces of the knotweed rhizomes and left them in the ground, you can see every little piece, as we mentioned before, can produce a new knotweed infestation. And not only do human activities cause this, they're also natural activities. So if we think back to that stream, where a high water event had come through and pushed, a lot of the knotweed into the water, those knotweeds are broken up. So there's a lot of little pieces floating around to become established. And not only are they going to become established, they're on water. So they're going to move down that riparian corridor and spread quite a distance. Our third way that we think of knotweed being spread is through contaminated fill. So we just talked about how those stem and rhizome fragments can be, lead to new infestations. You can only imagine the challenges if you were to buy some fill and there had been knotweed growing in it at some point and it still contained the stem and rhizome fragments, and then you brought it and, put it in your garden or along your driveway, and now you have a knotweed infestation as a result. A couple ways to avoid this are to utilize fill that is known to be knotweed free or certified weed free. Another way to get around this issue is if you do have fill brought to your property, leave it in place for a while before using it. And if knotweed does pop up, treat that knotweed before moving it to its final location. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton to Zach to talk about prevention and management of knotweed.
Thank you, Becca. Good morning, everyone. This is Zach Simic, the Conservation and GIS Analyst with APIP. So now that we have a great foundational knowledge of knotweed, thanks to Emily Bell and Becca, we know how to identify the plants, we know the impacts that they cause. Now we're going to learn what we can do to address knotweed if we encounter it on our properties that we own or manage. And Emily Bell, I just need control of the slideshow.
All right. Go ahead.
Got it. All right, so now that we know the impacts of knotweed, if you have this species on your property, you may be concerned and eager to get out there with your shovel, with your backpack sprayer, and try to remove this damaging pest. However, before we engage in management, it's important to take a moment to pause and consider the situation and some of the variables that are unique to your particular infestation and site. So before we engage in control of invasive species, it's always important to perform a site assessment to determine what tools you have in your toolbox, what, if any, sensitive features are around that should be considered, and what your goals or objectives for controlling this particular infestation or species might be. And all of this is a component or components of a process known as integrated pest management, which is something that we encourage all folks to follow in their control efforts. So integrated plant management or pest management, also known as IPM, is simply an effective and environmentally sensitive approach to control a pest species that relies on a combination of common sense practices. So that's some nice jargon, but what does it really mean? It's basically taking a moment to pause and look at the bigger picture and consider all the variables that are at play. This is a cyclical process that is continually evolving over time, and it starts with scouting. So this is putting your identification skills to the test. It is assessing your property, determining if you have knotweed present. If so, identifying it. What species is it? Is it Japanese, Bohemian, giant? We know that those species can be difficult to distinguish. The lucky thing for us is that actually all three of these knotweed species can be controlled using the same techniques. Once we know that we have knotweed on our property, this is where we perform that site assessment. So what are the management tools that we have available to us for this particular site? And we'll learn about them in a few slides. Think about things like sensitive features. Is there water nearby that we need to be concerned about if we're performing a chemical treatment? Are there desirable landscape plants nearby that we want to try to protect during our control efforts? Are there children or pets that may be in the area that we want to limit their exposure to our control efforts? Once we've evaluated all the tools in our toolbox, we'll select the best option and implement that at the appropriate time of the year and under appropriate conditions. And importantly, after that, we will evaluate our results. Did that tool perform the job to the level that we expected? If so, that's fantastic. We can continue to scout, to assess our site and retreat as necessary. If the tool that we utilized was not as effective as we may have liked, we may look back to our toolbox and determine if there is a more appropriate option that we can use. I mentioned earlier on about setting realistic goals. This is important, particularly when you're dealing with a species like knotweed, because we don't want to be disappointed, and we want to be realistic in what we can achieve. So when many folks are managing invasive species, I think a lot of us go right to number one, eradication. We want to completely eliminate this plant in its entirety from our property or from where it is located. However, that's not always a realistic goal, particularly for a species with an aggressive underground root system like knotweed. In many cases, once these species are well established, they may never be completely eradicated. And instead, we'll focus on a strategy such as containment to prevent that species from spreading, or suppression, which is simply reducing its size and abundance to mitigate some of the negative impacts it may have. That being said, just because we cannot completely eradicate a species does not mean that we should not take action, because we can still significantly reduce some of the impacts that it is having. So this is important to recognize and consider, because the higher level of control that you're seeking to achieve, the greater amount of resources and time you'll need to put into managing your site. So if you're attempting to eradicate knotweed on your property, expect to expend some significant time and effort to address that infestation. So what are some of the tools we have in our toolbox to address knotweed? First and foremost, we'll talk about prevention. If possible, we want to minimize the introduction and spread of the species on our properties and in our environment. We'll talk a little bit about manual control, chemical control using a couple different techniques, and finally we'll discuss biological control, which is a new approach that's on the horizon but not yet widely available. So prevention is the most cost-effective method and most efficient way to address knotweed. We want to prevent this species from becoming established on our properties in the first place. Some of the ways that we can do that are being mindful of materials that we're bringing into our sites, utilizing weed-free fill when possible. It seems like a no-brainer, but we want to make sure that we're not intentionally planting knotweed. Long ago, this was a highly desirable ornamental species that was used for its aesthetics and as a living fence or a hedge. And many of the infestations that we deal with today are vestiges of those ornamental plantings. We want to remember that this species spreads by fragmentation. So if it's already present on our property, we want to be mindful of activities we may be performing that could unintentionally spread it to new areas, such as mowing or digging. And whenever we're working in or around knotweed, we want to be mindful of equipment hygiene. So cleaning our tools like shovels, digging equipment, backhoes, tractors, those sort of things, to ensure we're not moving fragments of roots or stems. Unfortunately, many of the people on this call today said that they are familiar with knotweed, and I'm guessing that for many of you, it's because it's on your property. So once it's here, what can we do to control it? So we have a few different tools in our toolbox. We can use manual control, that is good old-fashioned elbow grease. It's the physical removal of plant material from a site. This is most effective for small infestations. If we remember back to Becca's presentation talking about the biology of this species, we know that it has a very extensive underground root system. We know that those roots and above ground stems can both spread by fragmentation. So if we're trying to control this species manually, it's important that we're removing all of that plant material. So we can use a digging tool to carefully remove those above ground stems and below ground roots, remembering that anything that's left behind, even a small fragment only an inch long, can regrow into a new plant. All plant material that is removed should be bagged up in a heavy-duty trash bag and placed in the sun to solarize or decompose for at least 2 weeks. After the plant material has solarized or decomposed, it can be disposed of in the waste stream. We generally do not recommend composting invasive plant material because unless you have a very high temperature compost pile, it's likely that the invasive plant material will remain viable and continue to grow. Most homeowners or landowners are probably going to be using manual control for very small infestations, maybe a handful of stems that are just starting to grow. If you're a transportation professional and you have access to heavy equipment, manual control can be used for larger sites. However, you will have to deal with a significant amount of excavated material and dispose of that property properly, which is often through deep burial. As infestations become larger, we often need to use more aggressive management techniques such as chemical controls. In the world of knotweed management, there are 2 commonly utilized chemical control techniques to address or deal with this species. One is foliar spray. This is most often used for large or dense infestations, and it involves applying a diluted solution of herbicide to the foliage or leaves of a plant. So this is the photo on the left. For knotweed, we can also use a specialized application technique known as stem injection, which is best for small infestations and for sensitive sites. And this utilizes a special piece of equipment to inject a small amount of concentrated herbicide into the hollow stem of each knotweed plant. And we'll break these down in more detail in the following slides. So just some general BMPs or best management practices to keep in mind when we're talking about chemical control of invasive species like knotweed. First and foremost, you should recognize and know your limits. If you're a non-certified applicator, that is, you're just a homeowner applying herbicide on your property, Recognize that you can only apply products on property that you rent, own, or lease. That means even if your neighbor has knotweed and you're treating your own, you cannot lend your neighbor a hand and go over to their property and perform a treatment. You're only allowed to treat on your property, even if it is not for compensation. You should always, always, always wear appropriate PPE or personal protective equipment. And how do you know what PPE to wear? It's listed on the herbicide products label. We want to be mindful of environmental conditions. Obviously, we do not want to apply any type of herbicides if rain is in the near-term forecast, if there is dew present on the foliage of the plants, if there is wind that could blow our herbicide spray off target, and so on. If you are a non-certified applicator, you should not be applying any herbicide products in close proximity to water. And we want to make sure that we're choosing an appropriate product to use for our target species and the setting in which it's being applied. For knotweed, we're most commonly using glyphosate-based herbicides. And more specifically, we want to select a product with at least 40% active ingredient. And this is something that will be listed on the front of the herbicide products label. Often if you purchase an herbicide in a hardware store or a big box store, you may find that the active ingredient is perhaps only 18%. This is not a strong enough product to control a tough species like knotweed. So you want to look for that 40%, which can often be found in something like an agricultural supply store. And lastly, we always encourage folks to be patient. Glyphosate-based products that we use for knotweed control are known as systemic herbicides, meaning they're absorbed by the foliage of the plant and translocated throughout its vascular system and down to its roots. This can take time, and you may not see visible decline in the plants for up to 2 weeks after treatment. So during that time post-treatment, you should not disturb the knotweed. Don't go out and cut it down. Don't perform another application. Just be patient and allow the herbicide to do its job.
Hey, Zach, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Is there a general rule of thumb of how far from water a private landowner should or homeowner should stay away?
From a regulatory standpoint, not particularly. It also depends a little bit on where you're tuning in from. Here in the Adirondacks, you're not allowed to manage terrestrial invasive plants within 100 feet of a wetland unless you have a permit from the Adirondack Park Agency. Outside the Adirondacks, we don't have that restriction. And it also is very dependent on the herbicide product that you're using. And you should always consult with the label for those types of restrictions.
Thank you.
So how can we apply our herbicides to control knotweed? We learned that there are two frequently used techniques, the first being foliar spray. So this would involve applying a diluted solution of herbicide to the foliage of the plant. So you would mix your product, your herbicide product, with water, following the manufacturer's label recommendations. And knotweed is generally treated with a 2 to 5% dilution of glyphosate-based herbicide, so relatively weak application rate. This is applied to the foliage using a backpack or handheld sprayer to the point that almost all of the leaves are wet, but you don't want to apply so much to the point that herbicide is running off the leaves of the plants onto the ground. So you want a nice coating, as you can see in the lower photo here. So before you mix your herbicide, if you're going to perform a foliar spray, you always want to read the label. There are safety recommendations as well as PPE guidance provided by the manufacturer on that label. You should also consider how much herbicide will be needed to treat your site. If you're dealing with a moderately sized patch, let's say 100 square feet, it's unlikely that you need to mix a full 4 gallons of herbicide to treat that site. We want to do our best to prevent having surplus herbicide after the treatment is complete, because then we have to deal with disposal of that product. So think about how much you want to need, and when you're mixing, be sure to wear your PPE, make sure you're not near any sensitive sites, and have a spill kit available in case you have an accident. And when we mix our product, we typically do what I call make the herbicide or the pesticide sandwich. So what we recommend is starting with half the volume of your diluent, which would be water, adding your herbicide product, and then finishing it off with water. This will help ensure that you're mixing the proper quantity of overall solution, and it can aid in mixing. Some other helpful tips for performing a foliar spray. Again, we'll reiterate, avoid mixing surplus herbicide solution because you'll have to deal with the disposal of that product. So mix only the amount you intend to use. We can always make more, but we can't make less. You can adjust your sprayer nozzle, as in the photo here, by tightening or loosening that tip to help achieve an appropriate droplet size. Tightening your nozzle will produce a finer spray, where loosening it will create larger droplets. We typically recommend that folks work from the inside of an infestation out. You can think about it as painting a floor. You don't want to be walking through areas where you've already treated. This will help limit your exposure. And you may choose to add an indicator dye to your spray solution. This is basically just a vegetable-based dye that will help you better track where you've already treated and where you need to go. These are often blue in color. Next, we'll discuss stem injection. So this is a more specialized application technique that involves using a special tool to deliver herbicide to the hollow stem of the knotweed plant. So you can see this is one design of an injector on the right-hand side. This is a nice blue unit. It has kind of a reservoir on the top that holds herbicide, and then it is fed through this squirt gun-like device through a sharp needle into the hollow stem of the plant. So we'll fill our reservoir with herbicide. This is a technique that utilizes herbicide at full strength. So basically right out of the jug and right into the tool. No dilution is needed. We'll insert the needle of the injection tool into the knotweed stem near its base. This is often performed between the second and fourth node, or little ring on the stem of the plant. We'll slowly depress the trigger of our injection device to deliver 2 to 5 milliliters of herbicide into the stem. We'll release that trigger, carefully remove the needle, and mark that stem so we can track our progress. And this technique needs to be repeated for each individual stem within that infestation. So if you're dealing with a large site, you can imagine that this is a pretty time-intensive process. However, it is very effective, and it is also very selective, so virtually no off-target impacts to other nearby plants. Some helpful tips: if you're performing a stem injection, you should calibrate and prime the injection tool before you begin your application. Instructions for calibration are provided by the manufacturer, and you can prime the device by carefully and smoothly squeezing the trigger several times to get the herbicide flowing through the device. When marking the stems, we recommend doing this above your injection site to prevent fouling the paint pen or marker that you're using. Often when you inject the stem, a small amount of herbicide may trickle out of the injection site down the stem. So if you're marking below, you're going to be putting your pen right into that herbicide. And typically stems that are smaller than a dime in diameter will not be injectable. We find that when you try to inject these small stems, they will split in half and then not hold that herbicide. So for these very small stems, you can either perform a foliar spray or manual control and dig those stems up. So you may be thinking to yourself, wow, this sounds like a great technique. It's very selective. I could use this on my property, but I don't have an injection tool. Well, we have good news for you. We have tools that are available for use by landowners through our stem injection tool loaner program. We provide a tool at no cost to the landowner for 1 week so that they can selectively treat knotweed on their own properties. We provide the tool, however, we do not provide the herbicide, and this technique cannot be performed by a non-certified applicator if you are near water. If you're interested in the tool, you can reach out to us following this presentation, and we'll provide you instructions on how you can pick this up with no contact at our Nature Conservancy office in Keene Valley. If you're a little intimidated by herbicide use and you would rather hire a professional, we can also provide guidance on that. This is required if you're non-certified and you want to have knotweed treated near water. You will need to reach out to a commercial pesticide applicator for assistance. And APIP does maintain a list of certified contractors with experience in invasive plant management, and it is something that we can provide to folks as a follow-up resource to this training. And lastly, I'll just very briefly mention this third control technique. So biological control is the use of a native pest to help control a target pest. So essentially we look back to the native range of where knotweed occurs, like East Asia and Japan. In knotweed's native range, we try to determine what types of predators, parasites, or pathogens keep that species in check. We isolate one of those predators and we bring it to the introduced range of knotweed, so that would be the United States. And after many years of research to confirm that this predator will only feed on knotweed and no other species, we can then release it into the environment to begin to act as a natural control for knotweed. So for many years, researchers have been looking into this insect known as the knotweed sphyllid. And just recently, it has been approved for release in the United States as a biological control for Japanese knotweed. Just this past June, during Invasive Species Awareness Week, researchers from Cornell University released this insect on a few knotweed stands in New York and are currently monitoring its efficacy. Basically, what the insect will do is feed on the sap of knotweed to reduce its energy supply. It will cause its leaves to twist up into tight knots so it cannot effectively grow. So this is a management technique that is on the horizon, but not yet available for widespread use. And in the long term, biological control is really the only long-term solution for a very widespread species like knotweed. So we'll be looking at this closely as it develops over the coming years. And with that, I am going to be passing things back off to our co-presenters.
Okay, great. Let me see if I have regained control. So I haven't been able to look at the chat, but I do want to say, you know, for all of we've scheduled a lot of time. One of the biggest resources that APIP can offer you all, or the entire region, is information. So please feel free to ask any question about anything specific that you heard, particularly in the management side of things. We're here to answer questions. So we've scheduled a lot of time today to answer questions. And I have more questions. I always have a lot of questions, so I might be asking some myself. And please, everyone, send good vibes to this biocontrol project, because that would be really, really amazing. So what kind of resources can the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program offer the community in the control? So we've talked a lot about, you know, different types of invasive species. Can it be eradicated? Can it be contained? Can it be suppressed? We're here to help you contain and suppress the spread and growth of invasive knotweeds on your property. So we talked about the stem injection tool. Personally, that is what I have used in the past, and I found a lot of success with it in a smaller scale environment. So please, when we, if this is something that interests you, what I also like about it is, admittedly, I'm not the best at math. And so if I can not do dilution factors for my species, or have somebody come help me for my herbicide, sorry, it's a lot more helpful for me, and it's really small scale. So when we talk about that, you know, the need for controlled and safe disposal of any unused herbicide, you really minimize that when you use the stem injection tool. It's also, it's a lot less impactful on the body than, say, digging and manual control, or even having to put on a backpack sprayer. Though you do have to be able to, you know, get down on your knees and get under the plant. So it requires some flexibility. So when we share out resources and a recording of this workshop, feel free to write us back or give us a call. Although actually, I'm sorry, calling is tricky because we're all working from home. But email us back if you're interested in, checking out the stem injector. We also have the list of, contractors that we have worked with in the past and present. This is in no way, an exhaustive list, and it is not a list of the only people APIP trusts and would work with in the future or in the present. So if you also have resources that you want to add, if you don't see someone listed on this, please feel free to share. But these are folks who have, they work in the Adirondacks, so they're familiar with our habitats, with our weather, with our wind, because between every different mountain, it could be a different weather pattern. And they understand what native species they don't want to be hitting. So please let us know if you want access to this list of contractors. We can share it out as well with the follow-up emails. And then we're here for technical assistance. In the long list of what Zach discussed with integrated pest management, we can help you, maybe not day or night, but definitely day, through email and talking on the phone. We can help you with a lot of different steps of integrated pest management when you're making a site assessment. So in terms of identification, hey, I think this is knotweed. I think it's growing next to, a patch of trillium. What do I do? We can help you with identification. We can help you with site assessment. Hey, I live near this wetland. Can you help me figure out how far I should be from the wetland? Or is it a wetland? Or, how far should I be from a riparian area? How far should I be from XYZ? We're here to answer those questions. And then we can help you with implementation. So I mentioned the stem injector tool and list of licensed contractors. Maybe we're also here to help you figure out what type of herbicide you would want to purchase and where, and even with the dilution factors. We want to empower you to utilize these tools safely in the environment. But there's another step to this. So, if you think outside of the box, if you want to organize in the future, not this year, a volunteer event, maybe we can help you know how to organize a volunteer event. Maybe we can help you figure out what you need for outreach and to gather people together safely. And again, this is in the future, when we can all safely host volunteer events again. So thinking outside the box, we're here to help you. In addition to volunteering or helping volunteer, we can help you not spread invasive species, but spread knowledge about invasive species. So we can outfit you with outreach materials if you want to share them with neighbors. If you happen to see knotweed, we have door hangers, so you can flip your neighbor a door hanger and teach them about knotweed and how to get involved as well. As Zach mentioned, private landowners have to perform chemical controls on their own property, so it might require some team building on your block or on your road, safely and distantly, of course. Moving forward, so we have actually, we're in the midst of an adoption process. APIP is. We have adopted a long-time program that a lot of you may be familiar with on the phone, the Regional Inlet Invasive Plant Program, or RIP for short, is a long-time program, I believe at least 10 years old, that it started in the Fulton Chain area near Old Forge in the town of Inlet to focus on managing and tracking and working with private landowners about on the issue of knotweed and controlling knotweed on private property. This program was hosted, it's a volunteer program, but it was hosted by the town of Inlet and then was adopted by the Hamilton County Soil Water Conservation District. And now the Nature Conservancy and APIP have adopted this program. So it's going to look a little different, and we're learning how to evolve the program to fit the Nature Conservancy's goals and existing long-term projects. So what these volunteers are doing that we've adopted into the Nature Conservancy family are helping to locate sites that have where the overlap of ecological key importance and logistics overlap. So is it a very ecologically sensitive area and the landowner is interested in, working with us to control it? Perfect. But we have limited capacity as a small staff, and so these volunteers really help get that information and collect data and do site assessments on the ground across the Adirondack region. They'll also assess sites prior to treatment. So this is also using, really narrowing down where we can use limited funds to hire professional applicators to go out and take care of knotweed. They'll secure landowner permissions to allow that treatment to occur. And then reporting and tracking new sites or existing sites using an app, an easy to use app that I'll share information about called IMAP Invasives, which APIP and other regional partners throughout the state utilize to set goals and understand different population distributions throughout their working geographies. And then these volunteers also spread the word about how to slow the spread of invasive species, particularly knotweed. So a lot of the information we shared with you today, they're also really educated on and passionate about, and so they also share information. This is our first year working with this program, and we anticipate it'll be, everything's different with, our current conditions with everything happening with the global pandemic, but it is an evolving program, and for year 1 and year 2 things might change, but if you're interested in getting involved, please reach out to us and we'll be sending out follow-up information, and that would be a great time to reach out and say, hey, I want to get involved. This map shows where we have some volunteer coordinators already working throughout the Adirondacks, in Tupper Lake and Saranac Lake, in Inlet, and then I'm not sure what these towns are. I do apologize. I'm learning my Western Adirondack and Southern Adirondack geography. So yeah, you could be a really great asset to helping people contain and suppress the spread of knotweed throughout the Adirondacks by joining this program. Other ways that APIP can help is we have a lot more workshops coming up. So I wanted to include information here about our Managing Milfoil panel that we'll be hosting next Wednesday. This is really geared towards folks who are involved in managing their lake. So are you a member of a lake association? Do you volunteer on a lake? Maybe you even have a private pond. All of the different ways in which you can manage milfoil. This, as another one of our colleagues calls it, this real Godzilla of a plant. Maybe it is equatable to knotweed for terrestrial and milfoil for aquatic. So come learn about control using scuba divers, using biocontrols, not the type of insect that Zach mentioned before, but its native predator is a weevil, using a low concentration of a new type of herbicide that is safe for use in the Adirondacks, and then how to navigate the permitting process from the Adirondack Park Agency. So come learn about all these different tools next Wednesday, and I'll share information about this. Then on August 12th, the following Wednesday, we actually have a family workshop. We're jumping into youth education. This will be a fun way not just to do an indoor learning of a 1-hour safely socially distanced Zoom call, but then there's ways to get involved out on the ground through self-guided family activities at the VIC, the Visitor Informative Center at Paul Smith College. So we'll be sending out information about that as well. So it's getting kids out there mapping and understanding what invasive species are and why they matter to Adirondack habitats. So without further ado, I would love to jump into questions. Let me go and see. So if anybody has any pressing questions, please vocalize them. And if not, I will go through the different questions that got typed into the chat. Oh, here's a good question for Zach and Becca. Who provides certification for fill to ensure that it's weed free? I know this is a complicated question for New York State.
So currently there is not a certified weed-free fill program in New York State. With that being said, there is a group of stakeholders that are working to maybe not come up with a certified fill program, but see what options are available and see what the key stakeholders, the aggregate facilities, are willing to do to offer these weed-free fills for landowners to use.
And I would add in the interim as well that it really also depends on the volume of fill material that you're looking to utilize. If you're a landowner that's just doing some general landscaping and you're purchasing bagged fill, then it's fairly certain that is weed free. If you're purchasing fill from an aggregate supplier, another helpful step that you can do, while not a perfect solution, is to ask your supplier, what are you doing to prevent the spread of invasive species? If that supplier cannot provide you with any type of answer, that's probably not a good sign. If they're able to tell you that they're monitoring their fill, they're looking for invasive plants on their yard, that might at least give you a little higher confidence in that material being used.
Yeah, like if you're looking for free fill, for instance, like on Craigslist, you'll often see like free fill available, must pick up. Asking the owner of said fill about these issues is a really important step. And if they're not able to answer, it might be good to just move on to the next Craigslist ad of free fill. And if you're maybe getting, for instance, I pass a need fill sign daily on my drive where we live to Saranac Lake, and I noticed that the road department, when they were ditching, they answered that person's call. So if making sure that the crew also understands that there wasn't anything in that fill is really important before you accept it. So the next question is, what would we mark the stems with?
So in our work, we most often just use a simple paint pen. So kind of like a little marker, but instead of, like a Sharpie, it's actually filled with paint. There's a little shaker ball in there. You could just use a standard Sharpie as well, but we find that sometimes that's a little bit harder to see on the stem.
Just a paint marker. Great. I also found that Sharpie can wipe off. Knotweed is really slick. The stems are really like slick, and it can just rub off almost like on a wet hand or something like that. These are great questions. How do you get to the interior of a thick patch to inject stems?
Yeah, that is a good question. Very carefully. So if you've ever peered into the interior of a knotweed infestation, sometimes it's actually not as thick as you may think from looking at it from the outside. So often it's not incredibly difficult to make your way through there, but we'll typically just move the canes apart. You can bend them fairly good amount before they'll break, so you can weave your way through carefully. And much like foliar spray, if we're doing injection, we'll usually start from the inside and work our way out. So yeah, just carefully meander in there.
Scientifically crawl in there. That's where the flexibility comes through, for sure. Another question refers back to, I believe, the biocontrol. Can you say what insect that is again, Zach?
Yeah, so it is the knotweed spillet. It's just a very small sap-sucking insect. Very plain looking.
I really hope it works. That'd be great, especially for long, for landscape scale, biocontrol is really, really, really important. And it's really interesting to watch nature take care of itself with a little bit of help. Here's a great question that I think I can answer. Our invasion is outside the Adirondacks in the Mohawk Valley. Any resources here? Absolutely. So APIP is one of 8 regional partners in invasive species prevention. No, I don't think I got that acronym right. I'm sorry. PRISM. We're a PRISM partner, and there are 8 different regions managed by PRISM partners throughout New York State. And we can connect you to the Capital Mohawk Region PRISM, or CapMo for short. So that's definitely something we can do and include in our follow-up resources, is just a link to how to get in touch with all the different PRISMs throughout the area. Because also what's really key is, you know, the Adirondacks doesn't have the biggest full-time population, right? A lot of our, you know, regional and seasonal residents are coming from other parts of New York State or outside of state. So connecting you to regional resources is something we can do. Another question from Pat is the chemical injector effective on any other invasive shrubs or trees?
Good question, Pat. So the injection tool can be used for a few other different invasive species. It's most often used for herbaceous plants, so those that have a non-woody stem, and for those that have a hollow stem. So for example, it can also be used to control large wetland grass called Phragmites. We've also used it to control things like giant hogweed and wild parsnip, or even yellow iris.
And if, you know, the list of species that Zach is mentioning too, we have, and I'll link to it in our follow-up email, we have a long list of species and outlines of, and photos and details and control methods on our website at adkinvasives.com. And it's a great place to just scroll through and, you know, check out other plants you, and maybe animals you might need to be aware of.
Emily, can I just add a note of something that I failed to mention in an earlier portion of the presentation, but just came to mind in talking about chemical control. So something that is important to consider whether you are performing an injection or a foliar spray is the timing of your application. This is something that I failed to mention, but knotweed is most effectively controlled with herbicide at peak growth. That is when the plants are beginning to flower. At this time, if you apply an herbicide, it is most likely to be translocated deeper into the root system. So if you're waiting for the optimal window to treat your knotweed, it is typically in August or early September. So just keep that in mind if you're considering performing a chemical treatment.
That is such a good point, Zach. And I would also mention that, you know, when you're performing your integrated pest management, when you're doing your scouting and your identification, really just the same way you might go check, oh, are those raspberries ready yet? Are my tomatoes ready yet? You're going to want to keep an eye on the knotweed growing on your property, because with, you know, depending on elevation, depending on what valley you live in, depending on how much rain you're getting, and then also with a changing climate, we've had a really hot summer this year. So, you know, the rule of thumb of what Zach just mentioned, August, September, is really important. But it could potentially, you know, it could be outside of that range. So just continuously scout and keep your eyes open and just observe the habitat around you. These are really great questions. So the same person who's talking about the Mohawk Valley is also dealing with invasive jumping worms. What a freaky annelid those are, and not yet observed in the Adirondacks that we know of. And I implore everyone to please come to our August 25th workshop about jumping worms. What are they? What do they do to the ecosystem? How to spot them, how to prevent their spread on trails while fishing. These are an emerging species, and those are the species that we have an opportunity for eradication and the most effective control. So please come to our August 25th workshop on invasive jumping worms. They are really, really creepy. I would have it as a Halloween thing, but if I want people to be out in the environment to go catch them. Here's another good question. If I happen to know a homeowner that dug up their some fill next to a knotweed patch that I've been observing and spread it around, and there might be stems and there might be roots, but they're not showing yet, what's a good initial control for this scenario? First off, I would say be gentle and friendly with your neighbor. Starting anything off in an accusatory way won't allow for bridge building or for project development between neighbors. It might help to wait and see if something's growing, because that person might be totally oblivious to the situation. And if you talk to them about an invasive plant that they have, they're going to be confused because they won't be able to see it. So one thing to see is, I know it would be a bummer to have to wait till something gets big, but if you start to see it sprout, that's when I would jump on sharing that information with my neighbor. And APIP can give you printed materials, and I could even talk it out with you about how to approach that person, and then let them know about what you learned about the damages that this plant can cause in the Adirondacks. You can share a news story with them. I know that we just had some great coverage about the importance of knotweed in the Sun Community News and the Adirondack. I believe the Explorer. It could have been the Almanac. I'm very sorry. Share information with them. And Zach and Becca, maybe do you have anything to add there before we get to approach the person and the scouting the situation, and then work on management together?
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. And for that type of situation, if you are suspecting that plants may emerge from root fragments, often those plants will be quite small and not very well established yet in the soil. So many times those little plants can be removed pretty effectively using manual control, just digging them out with a shovel.
Yeah, they would be really small. And if the fill is also new, that means that the soil, the sediment itself is not yet compacted or settled. So it might be really easy to pull out and throw that in a contractor bag, let them solarize, and put them into the typical waste stream rather than composting. Please don't compost these plant parts. Make that your mantra. But we have another good question. And that goes to solarization as well, of does putting black plastic over a cut back patch of knotweed work?
Yeah, we can share a little information about that. So the easy answer would be it depends. The more appropriate answer would probably be usually not. If you remember Becca's slide, she shared that about 2/3 of the biomass of knotweed is its root system. So what we've found in the past through some of our control work is that using black plastic or matting can be effective at killing above ground stems. However, even if you leave that black plastic or matting in place for well over a year, as soon as you remove that and the plants are exposed to sunlight, those tremendous below ground energy reserves in the root system will continue to sprout up plants. So you think about where this species occurs, in Japan, where there are volcanoes. I mean, the above ground plant parts get wiped out by lava flows and then still reemerge from their root system. So this is a pretty resilient plant.
I've attempted this myself in a community garden down in the city that I managed. It still took a lot of time with the removal. The manual control worked over time to just continuously exhaust the energy in those roots. We couldn't get every single root. For all we know, it was growing under another building like 2 doors down and would travel over to get to an open space. So we had that continuous management, that continuous digging up, that continuous scouting, that continuous weeding, and just keeping an eye on it. Over time, it got a lot smaller. which is great. And then the plants also got smaller, which was a lot easier for me. But covering it was really, really hard. We tried, you know, hardware cloth with black shade cloth. And you know what? The material cost was really high. So again, a lot of these answers are, it depends. Another question is, the Huck Preserve in Albany County is experimenting with putting screening over a cut patch and keeping them growing again. Yeah, I would love to see how it works for other folks. It depends. It depends is a lot of the questions. So that's why APIP is also here to just give us a call, because it depends, and we can walk through all these different scenarios with you. I had one more very specific question for Zach and Becca about foliar spray and safe conditions, and really gauging what is a safe condition for, you know, planning your work outdoors. And that is, how much wind is too much wind? And how do you both as land managers, you know, check wind conditions? Like, even what websites do you go to for the weather and making sure everything's accurate?
Yes, I mean, you can take a look at your local weather online. Often it's it's just, you know, going by feel. If you're out preparing to perform an application and you see, you know, leaves rustling on the trees, you can feel the breeze on your skin, that might be an indication that it's a little too breezy to perform your application. Typically, we're looking for 5 miles an hour or less. One of the ways that you can help address something like wind is to time your application towards the evening or in the morning when the weather may be a little more calm. And in terms of, I don't know what the rest of your question was, just other environmental conditions.
Oh, where do you check the weather? You know, would it be, sometimes we have mostly like commercial websites, but do you just, yeah, where do you check the weather so that other people hear? I know this is a silly question, but it's very important.
I often will just look on a Weather Channel app, or most often I'm just going by feel in the field based on the conditions at the site.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, if we don't have any more specific questions, I think that might be it. I'm glad, I know we finished a half hour early for everyone. We just wanted to make sure we had this block of time. If you have other questions, you know, I'll be, again, sharing out resources, and you'll all have our contact information. And I want to thank you all for participating in this workshop today. This was great, and I hope that you'll stay connected with APIP. Check out our website. I'll share it with you to look at species and different resources. Follow us on Facebook, and follow us on Instagram if you have an Instagram account, where we talk about different species and share out workshop information. And I'll also share out a way of how to get onto our listserv, which is managed by Cornell. Well, thank you so much. And yep, weather.gov is a good hourly wind chart by zip code, which is great. Of course, you got to check it yourself because every valley is different. It was raining across the road from my house yesterday, but I was dry. So it's mountain weather. Well, thank you all so much, and we look forward to working with you soon.